They were not defeated. They were sent. The year is 1942. The relentless summer sun burns over the Russian steppe, but the fiercest flame is that of the Nazi advance. The Wehrmacht is sweeping through the southern Soviet Union, pressing toward the Volga and the oil fields of the Caucasus. After a year of total war, the German war machine, under Operation Blue, threatens to swallow what remains of the motherland. Millions of Soviet lives have already been lost. The army is in tatters, and the ghost of collapse hangs over Moscow. Morale is broken. Entire units are retreating in disarray, which Joseph Stalin classified as psychological desertification. Defense gives way to uncontrolled flight, and the fear of a final defeat leads the Soviet High Command to a terrible and unprecedented decision. On July 28, 1942, from the top of the Kremlin, a decree emerged that was less a military strategy and more a desperate cry for survival. Order Number 227, the unofficial title, destined to be echoed in every trench and bunker, was an ultimatum: not one step back, ni shagu nazad. Stalin, in his role as People's Commissar for Defense, signed the document that transformed discipline into mandatory sacrifice. It prohibited, under penalty of immediate death, any unauthorized retreat from positions. The command formalized the grim certainty that the Red Army had exhausted its supply of land. But the mechanism of the order is what would make it infamous. To ensure compliance, Order 227 instituted the barrier troops, or blocking detachments. These units were not there to fight the German enemy. They were positioned in the rear to shoot any Soviet soldier who attempted to flee the front line without an express order. Furthermore, the order formalized the creation of the penal battalions, the feared Strafbats, formed by demoted officers and soldiers accused of cowardice or negligence. These men were sent to the most suicidal sectors of the front, with the promise of rehabilitation only through death in combat. The enemy was not just ahead, it was also to the rear. The choice was clear: fight or be executed. This was the terrible condition that transformed exhausted and frightened men into the most bitter and paradoxically resilient pawns of the Soviet sacrifice. They would pay the price of lost territory with their own bodies. Order Number 227, issued on July 28, 1942, by Joseph Stalin acting as the People's Commissar of Defense, was concise and relentless. Not one step back. Its focus was the complete inflexibility in the defense of Soviet territory, transforming unauthorized retreat into an act of military treason. Technically, the execution of this doctrine of sacrifice manifested in two main mechanisms: penal battalions and barrier detachments. In critical locations on the Eastern Front, such as the Stalingrad region, the order was implemented with the lethal rigor of the internal security forces, notably NKVD units. The penal battalions, known as Strafbat, were formed by demoted officers and soldiers convicted of disciplinary or criminal offenses, assigned to the most dangerous missions with the promise of rehabilitation through the shedding of blood. Such units were, in practice, cannon fodder, with an extremely low life expectancy, and were often used to clear minefields or conduct suicidal frontal assaults against fortified German positions, such as the defensive lines of the German Sixth Army advancing on the Volga River. The barrier detachments, on the other hand, were composed of NKVD troops positioned in the rear of the Red Army combat units. Their tactical mission was to stop, by any means, the unauthorized retreat of combat soldiers. The operational rule was simple: any military personnel who retreated without an explicit order from a superior was summarily detained, and if they persisted in retreating, shot on the spot. In terms of scale, Order 227 stipulated the creation of 3 to 5 well-equipped barrier battalions per active army, totaling hundreds of men distributed along the front line with light armament and heavy machine guns to maximize firepower against any fleeing units. Although the main pressure was on the most demoralized infantry regiments and divisions that had already suffered heavy losses in the southern Russian steppes and the Caucasus, the effect of the order propagated throughout the entire military system. In Stalingrad, where the front line became the city itself, the fighting was waged block by block in brutal urban combat. The refusal to retreat turned every building, such as Pavlov's house or the barricade factory complex, into a point of sacrifice. with NKVD troops ensuring that the garrisons of these positions held the line to the last man, regardless of the cost in lives. The order not only forced soldiers to fight the enemy at the front, but also imposed the threat of immediate execution by their own comrades in the rear, cementing the concept of sacrifice as the only alternative to defeat. The most infamous decree of the Soviet High Command, known as Order Number 227, and immortalized by the maxim, "Not one step back," was issued on July 28, 1942, by the People's Commissar of Defense, Joseph Stalin, in a moment of despair facing the relentless advance of the Wehrmacht in the southern Soviet Union, particularly towards the Volga and the strategic city of Stalingrad. The implementation of this directive was not merely a rhetorical motivation, but a detailed technical policy with direct effects on the military organization and the fate of the Red Army soldiers. To ensure tactical inflexibility and halt disorganized retreat, Order 227 implemented two brutal organizational measures: the creation of penal battalions, Strafbats, and the blocking detachments, barrier troops. The penal battalions were formed by commanding officers deemed guilty of cowardice or instability, who, stripped of rank and decorations, were sent to the most difficult and dangerous sectors of the front, fulfilling a sacrificial role with a notoriously low life expectancy, with each front being required to form 1 to 3 of these battalions. Regarding direct control of the front line, the order stipulated that each army should create blocking detachments of up to 200 men, totaling 3 to 5, positioned in the rear of the most active combat units. The explicit mission of these detachments was to shoot soldiers or commanders who attempted to retreat without an express order, functioning as a human military wall that forced assault and infantry troops to fight to the death against the German invader, transforming retreat into treason punishable by summary execution. It was during the Battle of Stalingrad, where fighting was concentrated in enclosed urban environments, such as the tractor factory, Mamayev-Kurgan Hill, and the grain elevators, that Order 227 was applied with the greatest rigor, raising the human cost of defense to the level of pure sacrifice. The iron discipline imposed by this directive led to the execution of approximately 13,500 Red Army soldiers by Soviet authorities themselves during the period of the battle in the city. The terror of Order 227, with its penal battalions and blocking detachments, remained an active policy of the Red Army until October 1944, when the strategic situation of the Soviet Union in the East had already decisively turned around. The People's Commissariat for Defense Directive Number 227 of July 28, 1942, issued directly by Joseph Stalin, established the not one step back policy as an unshakable operational principle of Soviet defense on the Eastern Front, especially during the crisis of 1942, with the Battle of Stalingrad as its most brutal theater. Technically, the execution of this order was based on the creation and expansion of two types of punitive units: the penal battalions, known as Strafbats, and the blocking detachments, or Zagradotriadi. The command required that each combat front establish 1 to 3 Strafbats for senior officers, while smaller units, the penal companies, were formed for enlisted men and non-commissioned officers, all of whom were sent to the most dangerous sectors of the front with the mission to redeem guilt with blood. The operations of these battalions were governed by the Status of the Army Penal Units, a document issued on September 26, 1942. Concurrently, and more immediately at the front line, the Zagradotriadi were implemented. The tactical function of these blocking detachments was strictly surveillance. They were positioned in the rear of Red Army divisions, particularly those considered unstable or prone to retreat under enemy pressure, with orders to open fire summarily against any military personnel who attempted to retreat without superior authorization. The implementation of these directives, which transformed retreat into a literal impossibility, cemented determination in critical locations like the ruins of the industrial city of Stalingrad, where units such as the 62nd Army, under the command of General Chuikov, felt the constant and fatal presence of the rear platoons, ensuring that individual sacrifice became the only means to advance or defend the position. Order Number 227, issued on July 28, 1942, by the People's Commissar of Defense, Joseph Stalin, crystallized the policy of not one step back, Ni Shagu Nazad, at a critical moment when the Red Army was alarmingly retreating, notably on the southern front, opening the way for the German advance towards the Volga and the city of Stalingrad. The command was a military measure with two technical pillars: the formation of penal battalions, Strafbati, and the establishment of barrier troops, Zagraditelnie Otriadi. In terms of regimentation, the order stipulated that each combat front should create 1 to 3 penal battalions, composed of officers and non-commissioned officers accused of misconduct and disciplinary failures. These units were allocated to the most dangerous sections of the front line, generally on high-risk assault missions, and were divided into a variable composition of convicts and a constant staff of command and guard personnel. Typical infantry penal battalions received the toughest assignments, essentially serving as tactical cannon fodder, with the promise of rehabilitation and reintegration into their original units after proving their bravery through combat or serving the determined sentence time. The most drastic and technically oriented measure involved the barrier troops, who were to be positioned in the rear of divisions in combat. Point 4 of Order 227 established that each army should form barrier detachments of up to 200 men, equipped with machine guns, to fire at panicking and disorganized troops retreating without an explicit order from command. Such detachments operated with the explicit mission of halting the flow of retreating soldiers, executing cowards and deserters on the spot. These blocking units, often operated by the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, NKVD, were not a complete innovation as they had existed in a less standardized form since 1941. But Order 227 made them mandatory and systematic throughout the entire Eastern Front. The application of this relentless discipline was particularly intense in the regions along the Don and the Volga, where armies like the 62nd Army in Stalingrad depended on reinforcements and supplies crossing the river under constant fire, and where any unauthorized tactical retreat meant the risk of total defensive collapse in a location of supreme strategic importance. The mechanism of the order transformed every front line, especially in the Battle of Stalingrad, into a sacrifice zone, where death in advancing against the Axis forces became the only alternative to immediate execution by their own rear troops. The operational directive that sealed the fate of thousands of Soviet combatants, officially known as Order No. 227, was issued on July 28, 1942, at a moment of acute crisis on the southern flank of the Eastern Front, notably after the fall of Rostov-on-Don. The People's Commissar for Defense, Joseph Stalin, established the motto, "Not one step back," Ni Shagu Nazad, transforming unauthorized retreat into a capital crime and codifying the tactic of forced sacrifice. The technical mechanism of the order resided in two distinct military structures: the Strafbats, penal battalions, and the barrier detachments, blocking troops. Under Order No. 227, each front of the Red Army was obliged to form 1 to 3 penal battalions, composed of convicted officers, and a greater number of penal companies, intended for enlisted men and sergeants. These Strafbats were deliberately launched against the most dangerous sectors, such as the Volga crossings during the Battle of Stalingrad, or on reconnaissance in force missions in the Kursk salient, with the promise of rehabilitation after completing a period of service, typically 3 months for the infantry. Their tactical role was often that of fire witness, missions with extremely high losses, to clear the way for regular units, absorbing the initial brunt of enemy fire. In parallel, the immediate and relentless enforcement of the no-retreat policy was guaranteed by the barrier detachments, units deployed directly behind the frontline infantry divisions. Each army was to form 3 to 5 of these detachments, which could have up to 200 men. Although formally composed of Red Army rear personnel and punitive Cheka units, their composition after Order No. 227 frequently included NKVD, People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, troops for rear protection. The tactical function was to detain and force the return of any soldiers in disorganized retreat. If the retreat persisted or was motivated by panic, detachment members had orders to shoot cowards and alarmists on the spot. This armed coercion transformed the Soviet front line into a bidirectional killing zone, where death by enemy fire at the front was accompanied by the threat of summary execution by their own rear troops in case of disengagement from battle. Order number 227, issued by People's Commissar of Defense Joseph Stalin on July 28, 1942, formalized the scorched earth policy in the rear of the troops and imposed the doctrine of not one step back on the Red Army, transforming the unauthorized retreat into a capital crime on the Eastern Front. The technical execution of the command rested on the introduction of blocking detachments, specialized units whose tactical function was to position themselves in the rear of combat formations, particularly those considered unstable or prone to panic. At an operational level, each rifle army of the front was supposed to have 3 to 5 of these blocking detachments, each composed of up to 200 men, generally drawn from security troops or directly from the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, NKVD. Their mission was to shoot any soldier in unauthorized flight, transforming retreat into a greater risk than remaining on the front line against the Wehrmacht. The order also stipulated the formation of penal battalions, where officers and non-commissioned officers, guilty of violating discipline through cowardice or instability, were sent, being allocated to the most difficult areas of military operations as a punishment and sacrifice. The city of Stalingrad, besieged by the German 6th Army and the 4th Panzer Army, became the epicenter of the most brutal application of Order 227, where the uncompromising defense of the industrial sector ruins and Mamayev-Kurgan Alley was guaranteed not only by the heroism of units like the 62nd Army under the command of General Chuikov, but also by the lethal pressure exerted by the NKVD detachments. These barrier posts, often equipped with machine guns and automatic weapons, were the last line of defense, or rather, the first line of disciplinary execution. The tactic transformed the combat front into a deadly corridor. Surrender or retreat meant death at the hands of the enemy or compatriots. Order number 227, issued on July 28, 1942, by the People's Commissar for Defense, Joseph Stalin, established the Red Army's military policy of not one step back, nishagu nazad, in response to the catastrophic German advance that threatened the loss of Stalingrad and the Caucasus region. The technical objective of the directive was to restore discipline, employing brutal methods of coercion. The order was based on 2 organizational pillars: the creation of penal battalions, Strafnai Bataloni, or Strafbat, and the blocking detachments, Zagraditelnye Otriadi. The order stipulated that each army front, such as the Stalingrad front, should establish 1 to 3 penal battalions, each with about 800 men, composed of officers judged for cowardice or disciplinary infractions. These battalions, often assigned to the most dangerous assault missions, such as at crucial points in the Battle of Stalingrad, operated on the front line, seeking blood to wash away the guilt of their members, with an extremely low life expectancy. In parallel, each army was to form 3 to 5 penal companies, with 150 to 200 soldiers and non-commissioned officers, intended for high-risk tasks. The second pillar of the military policy was the blocking detachments, tactical units positioned in the rear of combat divisions and regiments to prevent unauthorized retreat. Order number 227 required that each army on the Eastern Front establish 10 blocking detachments, each composed of about 200 men, equipped to shoot soldiers who fled the battlefield without orders. During the Battle of Stalingrad, July 1942 to February 1943, these detachments operated intensely on the banks of the Volga River and in the industrial areas of the city, ensuring that the exhausted units of the 62nd and 64th Armies maintained their fortified positions, transforming buildings like Pavlov's house into non-negotiable points of sacrifice. Coercion was also massively applied during the Battle of Kursk, July-August 1943, where the shock formations of the penal battalions were launched in suicidal attacks against German positions, often preceding the regular units, to weaken the enemy defense and clear minefields, ensuring the men remained through the terror of the rear. The threat of being summarily executed by the blocking detachments or being sent to a Strafbat to fight in the most difficult areas forced thousands of men to stay in their positions, making the rear itself a battlefield where flight was punished with death. The no-retreat order, codified as Prikaz number 227 and issued on July 28, 1942, by the People's Commissar for Defense, Joseph Stalin, had as its fundamental military principle the elimination of unauthorized retreat, transforming the ranks of the Red Army into a wall of sacrifice. The technical implementation of this directive unfolded into two main structures of coercion: the penal battalions, Strafnoi Battalion, and the blocking detachments, Zagraditelny Otrayadi. At the front level, Army Group, the order established that each command should form 1 to 3 penal battalions, composed of officers guilty of disciplinary breach due to cowardice or hesitation, who were sent to the most dangerous sections of the front to redeem themselves with their own blood, effectively serving as sacrificial assault infantry at points of greatest friction, such as in the approaches to the Stalingrad front and the Don front. Simultaneously, on a more immediate and tactical control scale, the order determined that each army should create 3 to 5 blocking detachments, which would be positioned in the rear of divisions and regiments deemed unstable. These blocking units, equipped with heavy machine guns and rifles, had the explicit sanction to shoot to kill any soldier in unauthorized retreat, turning the space between the front line and the rear into a deadly zone. The operational objective was clear: to force the troops to remain in position, with death at the hands of the Germans at the front being preferable to summary execution by their own comrades in the rear. Such coercive measures aimed to solidify combat morale through disciplinary terror and ensure that the refusal to retreat became the only possible course of action in crucial sectors of the Soviet defense. The command was simple: not one step back. Order number 227 from Joseph Stalin turned retreat into a crime and the front line into a slaughterhouse. The campaign was not just a battle against the Nazi enemy, it was a two-front war. The real price was paid in the blood of fellow citizens. In 5 months following the promulgation of Order 227 in July 1942, the Red Army executed over 13,500 of its own soldiers who attempted to retreat or desert. The fate of thousands of others was sealed in the feared Strafbats, the penal battalions, thrown into the most dangerous missions. If they weren't killed by German fire, they faced the blocking detachments, the NKVD barrier troops, who positioned machine guns behind their own lines, ensuring that the fear of treason was greater than the fear of death. This order stopped the hemorrhage of retreat and forced a resistance that culminated in the victory at Stalingrad, changing the course of World War II. But for thousands of young men, the success of the motherland meant forced sacrifice, summary execution, or condemnation to a unit where survival was statistically impossible. They won the war, but the regime beat them first. This is the terrible truth of one of history's most radical orders.